Good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, as Anita said, it would be changing from bees to cows. So this is basically data from two studies that that was done in the last 2 years at UNH from one of my PhD students that is now working for Purina. So that's basically his work. A little bit of the outline, we'll be looking at a little bit of background about field peas. Study one that will compare, corn, soy versus field peas, and a second study that we're looking at cornmeal versus field peas, and then canola and field peas versus soy and field peas, and some conclusions. For those that are not that familiar with peas, so it's produced in the northern Great Plains and also in Canada. That's where primarily most of the production comes from. One thing about peas, I would say it's high in both, in starch and also protein. But most of the protein is basically soluble. That means that's rapidly degraded in the rumen, which could, reduce nitrogen use efficiency by the cows. So that's why some of the motivation of this study here was to better understand that. And you can see that one of the fractions of the proteins, again, fraction A here indicates that it's mostly soluble in the rumen. Another point that maybe motivated this study was the lesser risk of GMO within the field peas compared to corn and soy. And this appears to have some new shifts in the markets. Companies like the French Danone, it appears to get in the US market now, and they're very interested, for instance, in no GMO in the conventional system, and they have these ideas in terms of that. Also, field peas could be alternative to soy, to corn and soy, depending on the situation. Another point here, just to give you an idea in terms of price, you can see that organic feeds are way more expensive than conventional feeds. Just an example here, ground field peas, you can see the difference between the organic and conventional. That's normal for all feeds, that either organic or conventional. But as I said, in a mix of 60-40 corn meal, soybean meal, you could potentially replace that mix with field peas. And depending on the situation, primarily in the conventional sector, it could be less pricey, 580 tons versus 670 if you compare, both. It could potentially be beneficial in certain situations in terms of price. That's nutrient profile. You can see, as I said, it's high in protein, about 21% crude protein, and high in starch, as compared to the other two sources, soybean and cornmeal. Another point here, some studies show that when field peas are added to about 20% in the rations, you had no negative impacts on intake of the animals, on milk composition. Another study that was done in Idaho here, when they fed about 15% of the diet, again, no effect on dry matter intake and milk composition. However, when you increase the levels, this was done in South Dakota, when they start to feed at levels that are 24 or 30% of the diet, almost replacing all corn and all soybean in the rations, then they saw linear decrease in dry matter intake and milk protein yield. So at that point, at higher levels, it appears that the soluble protein in peas really has a negative impact on production. So that's where we had our interest, was looking at the amino acid profile. If you see the field peas, and these are the most limiting amino acids for dairy cows in typical North American diets. You see histidine, lysine, and methionine. So if you see field peas are quite low in methionine, just 1% compared to canola or soybean. So that could be a limitation in terms of utilization of field peas in some of those diets. even though it's a very good source of lysine, about 7.3%. So the objective of this study initially was to look at, again, at the performance of those cows when they're fed about 25% of the diet as field peas, and we had rumen-protected amino acids added. So one of the limitations could be amino acids. We are adding amino acids to the diet, and those amino acids are not being degraded in the rumen. So basically, those amino acids pass through and go and are available in the intestine of the animals. So we hypothesized that field peas soluble protein, when it's added to amino acids, it would be, better than urea in a urea diet when you compare field peas with rumen-protected amino acids, and could be, again, similar to a corn soy meal diet. So those studies will use 16 cows. Those are high-producing cows, about 100 pounds of milk. And basically, I'm just showing a snapshot of the data here, that basically showing the milk production data and also the amino acids data, so you can have an idea in terms of how those animals perform. And animals that are, 89 days in milk. So here's the experimental diet. So what I want to emphasize here are 2 points. So you see the diets have urea as our negative control. Urea is very high in soluble protein. Field peas diets also very high in soluble protein. And then you have the CSAAs, the corn soy diet with protected amino acids. That will be our positive control. And basically the major difference in those diets, either if you add or not field peas, and if you add or not the protected amino acids. The lysine to methionine ratio, you can see that the negative diet, it's 3.59 to 1. So that it's above what's been recommended by the NRC. And you see the protected diet of the amino acids is very close to what the NRC recommends, which is 3 to 1. And that we have that by adding those amino acids to the rations. You can see that CSAA diet and the FPA, the field peas diet, they are very close to the recommendations in terms of the amino acid requirements of those cows. So these are the diets. So those very quickly here I want to focus is just the crude protein. You can see the diets of 15% crude protein. That's low relative to many of the commercial diets, but that's also important in terms of to reduce the nitrogen impact. And you can see the soluble protein the soluble protein are high in the peas, and the urea 49%, as you'd expect, and the field peas and urea are the highest ones because those are very high in soluble protein. Oops. Something happened here. Not working.
I'm going to switch you out.
Thanks. So the way that I'm going to show here is basically the comparison that I'm going to be doing is basically comparing the urea versus the field pea diets, the two diets with protected amino acids, and then the field peas without amino acids and the field peas with amino acids. That's how it's basically comparing this data here. When you looked at just the field peas and the urea diet, you can see that dry matter intake was relatively similar, no difference there. A little bit higher actually, the dry matter intake. When you look at the milk production of those cows, very similar, no difference in milk production. And there was a difference in milk urea nitrogen. You can see that the diets with field peas has lower milk urea, that's milk protein. They had higher milk protein compared to the urea diet. And another point here is the milk urea nitrogen was lower with the field peas diet. So when you compare the diets at high NPN or high non-protein nitrogen, so the field peas seems to be a little better than the urea-only diet because it has higher intake and higher milk protein yield. So produce more protein, so that means relatively more money for the farmers. So you looked at the essential amino acids, and 2 points here that I want to emphasize. Some of the amino acids in the plasma, like isoleucine, which is a branched chain amino acid, essential amino acid, lysine, which is one of the most essential amino acids for dairy cows, and another branched chain amino acid here, valine. All of those were higher in the field peas when you compare to urea, and that may be related to the increase in milk protein yield that I showed in the previous slide. Now the other 3 diets. So if you see in terms of milk production, there's no difference if you have the diets that had corn, soy versus the field peas diets. But when you looked at, that's the intake, when you looked at milk production here, again, no difference. However, when you looked at milk protein, again, you see that the diets with field peas versus field peas amino acids, when you add amino acids, you improve the milk protein in the milk, so the milk protein yield. And no difference between the diets with either field peas amino acids versus corn soy with amino acids. That means that the field peas really miss some of those amino acids that were added as methionine and lysine. So, and this data actually show that. So if you compare first some of those amino acids that I said that's very essential, histidine, leucine, lysine, methionine, those were, if you compare the corn soy with the field peas amino acids, you can see that there are difference on those amino acids, and that's probably related to the difference in the amino acid profile that I showed earlier. Even though you have a statistical difference among those amino acids, there is no difference in terms of milk production, milk protein yield. When you looked at the other set of contrasts here, you look at the field peas versus the field peas added with amino acids, then you see a difference in the amino acid profile. But in this case, those cows produced less protein, those cows that were on the field pea diets. That indicates again that if you're going to feed field peas at levels that are close to 20-25% of the dry matter intake of those cows, you're probably going to have to add some of those protected amino acids. So one point that if you see here very quickly, one point that I emphasize is that histidine appears to be reduced when you fed field peas with amino acids, and that could be a further limitation. So when you supply the lysine and methionine, a third amino acid seems to be deficient. So we try to understand what was happening and how we could mitigate some of that problem. So the second question was how to improve the histidine in some of those field pea diets. And canola meal has been shown by several studies, Canadian studies showing that feeding canola meal increased dry matter intake and milk production. Another meta-analysis showed that canola meal increased all of the essential amino acids and tendency to increase histidine. So that's why we got interested in canola meal and field peas diets. And then another study showing that the duodenal flow of methionine and lysine and histidine were high in field peas, in canola comparing to soybean meal. So it could be that canola could be an option in terms to improve the histidine status of those animals. So the objective of the second study was to evaluate the performance of those cows either fed field peas and canola versus soybean meal with or without rumen protected methionine. So the hypothesis was that canola meal will improve plasma essential amino acids concentrations versus soybean meal when they fed at 25% of the diet. Another hypothesis, the canola meal will improve dry matter intake of those cows and also milk production compared to soybean meal. And finally, the field peas would require methionine supplementation because field peas are a very poor source of methionine. So when you looked at some of the data, again, we used 16 cows, cows that are close to 80 to 9 pounds of milk, and heavier animals, they are a little bit late in lactation than the previous study. We use experimental design in a 2x2 factorial. And here is the diet. As you can see, basically have the soybean diet, the canola meal diet, and primarily a corn grass legume silage, some cornmeal. And again, the major difference of those diets, either you have soybean meal or canola meal, and those diets were either or not supplemented with methionine, and both diets have the same amounts of field peas, as you can see here, 25% of the diet. So if you looked at intake, those cows are consuming almost 29 kilos. That would be almost 45 pounds, more than that of dry matter intake on a daily basis. And the cows that were on the canola meal diet was consuming more than the cows on the soybean meal diet. And those cows also were producing more milk. So canola was producing a little bit more milk than the cows on the soybean. There was a statistical difference there. And third point here was milk urea nitrogen that seems to be lower in the canola meal. So that means canola meal is being more nitrogen efficient. The cows are eating more and producing more milk. Not a big difference, but statistically was a difference there. When you looked at milk protein concentration, milk protein yield, first thing here, you can see that there is no difference when you compare the canola versus soybean meal diets. However, when you add the methionine, you see an improved in milk protein synthesis. So again, as I said, the field peas is a poor source of methionine. When you add methionine to the diet, you see a response. In terms of milk protein yield, then the cows that were on canola meal was producing more milk protein than those that were fed soybean meal. In terms of the amino acids, I want to show that histidine, you see the significant interaction here. That means that histidine was highest when you fed canola. Okay, so that goes together with the hypothesis that canola could be a good source of histidine to cows that are fed field peas. Another point here that I want to mention, it's the most essential amino acids like lysine, methionine for high-producing dairy cows. You can see that the protein source, in other words, the canola meal diets led to higher concentrations of those amino acids in plasma, and that it's an indication that it could answer the question in terms of milk protein yield, why that was higher. So some of the conclusions that come with this study is that high dietary inclusions of field peas at the expense of soybean meal and corn meal should be come together with rumen-protected methionine, and also a possible source of histidine that could be canola. And canola meal in general result in better milk production, in better amino acid profile, and better milk protein yield than soybean meal. So it corroborates a lot of the research that's out there when you compare soy versus canola. Okay, that some of the acknowledgements of the companies that fund this study, and also UNH and Ag Experimental Station. And I'll open for a couple of questions.
Yeah. So Andre, would you then have a soybean and a canola and a field pea mix, or would that not be?
Well, I mean, it could be that three-way, mix. In this case here, we're primarily looking at initially when you feed those high levels, it seems that peas, you know, it lacks some of those amino acids. Basically, on the data, you know, canola is a better source of histidine and even methionine than soybean. I think that would be a better complement than soybean meal. So
for an organic producer, would they have a higher likelihood of finding organic canola versus organic soybean, especially from a GMO standpoint? I know that we have GMO canola as well, but
you're right.
But would they more likely find that, and what would the cost be in terms of substituting in a canola and field peas versus the traditional corn soybean mix?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure about the if you would have more or less available canola GMO or no as comparatively. What I know that the field peas likely you're going to find less GMO in the field peas than the other more traditional crops. In terms of availability, I also need to take into account that a lot of the field peas goes to food, not to feed, and you add that layer of complication. For instance, I didn't want to use organic field peas in this study because it's way more expensive, and I didn't find it. I didn't find the conventional. I just find it just organic. So it appears that there is more organic available field peas to buy here in the Northeast than conventional available, and that's because you see more field peas in organic diets than in conventional diets. But to the standpoint that it could be an alternative source to corn and soybean, that's why I think it motivates. So like 5 years, 6 years ago, corn price was very high. So when you have those kind of situations, so alternative could be, you know, I don't think field peas would be something that you're going to be feed a lot, you know, again in farms here in the Northeast anyways, but it could be something. Yep.
Thank you. Sorry, we didn't have time for more questions.